Welcome to the biggest and most exciting part of the course. So this is where we're going to take all the HTML, CSS, and design skills that you have been learning and finally apply them to designing and building a huge real-world project. So in this section, you will learn both the theory and the practice of building a real-world website, along with a ton of new CSS techniques and best practices to expand your CSS toolkit even further. And all this will definitely bring you to an intermediate level CSS developer. So this will be a ton of fun, and so I can't wait to finally start working on this project with you. So this section is all about building a real-world project. Now, designing and building a website is not simply writing some code. It's a lot more than that. So it's actually a whole development process that requires a lot of careful thinking and planning, and all that before you even write a single line of code. And so before we start building our project, let's actually learn the 7 steps that are part of the development process, so that you know exactly how to proceed once you want to start building your own websites. So, as an overview, here we have the 7 steps that are part of the development process that is behind building any website. So first, we need to define and to plan the project. Then we start thinking about the layout of the page and create some initial sketches. And only then, after these 3 phases, we can finally start designing and building the website. Then, once that is done, we need to, of course, test and optimize that page before we can actually launch it. But even then, we are not done, because any website that is live on the web needs to be maintained and updated. Okay? And so now let's take a look at these 7 steps here one by one, starting with defining the project. And in this step, the first thing that we do is something very simple, which is to simply define who the website is actually for. So for example, is it for yourself, or is it for a client of your freelancing business, or maybe even the agency that you work in? So this sounds trivial, but it's still important to do this. Then after, you define what the website is actually for. So basically, you need to decide what's the main goal or the main purpose of the site. Is it to provide information or to sell some product, or is it simply to entertain the user? And by the way, these 3 purposes that I just mentioned, so providing information, selling something, or entertaining, are the 3 most common goals of websites. Now, based on what we learned in the lecture on user experience, defining what the website is for is basically the same thing as defining business and user goals, right? So in other words, this is basically what this step here is all about. It's about defining your business goals and user goals for this particular project. And of course, you don't need to overcomplicate things here. So this can be something very simple and very quick. So let's take as an example a company that produces premium dog food. So when this company sets out to create a new website, their business goal will probably be to sell that premium dog food, right? Now, on the other hand, when the user visits this website, their goal will probably be to find high quality dog food and also find it for a good price. So you see, this is just something very simple, but it's still important to have this defined. Finally, what you also need to do during this step is to define a target audience for your project. And here, try to be really specific if you can, and if it makes sense for your particular project. And many times, actually, this comes from your client, and so then you don't need to worry about this. But usually, when the client is smaller, they don't have this well defined, and in this case, you should totally do this part. And again, this can actually be quite simple. So taking again the example of the dog food company, here we could say that the target audience is women, which are 20 to 40 years old, live in Europe, earn a good salary of 2,000 euros a month, and they have a passion for dogs. So as you can see, here we have a really specific target audience, which of course you will not always be able to do, but if you can, then it is always very good to have a precise idea of who exactly you're building the website for. And actually, this is basically the whole point of this first step here, because you will want to design your project with all the goals and the target audience in mind. So of course, the reason for that is that the better you know who you build the website for and what you want to achieve with it, the more success your project will have in the end. And so this step will really be the foundation on which you will build the project later on. So do not just start building a website without this step, all right? Now, you could go really deep in this step alone here. So stuff like competition research and user personas and all stuff like that. But then we're going really deep into marketing territory, and that is, of course, outside the scope of this course. And so let's now move to the second step, which is planning the project. And this planning should, of course, be based on the business goals, user goals, and the target audience that you defined in the previous step. Now, planning the project means to finally start thinking about our website. And so that starts with actually planning and gathering the content of the website. So things like the website copy, which is basically the text, images, videos, and all other type of content. Now, usually this content should be provided by the client, but of course you can also help them to build, so to produce and to find this content for them. So when it's a big company, then many times they do this part for you. But in my experience in smaller companies, so if you have like a smaller client, then they usually don't have this content yet. And so maybe in that case, you'll have to write it yourself or even hire some other copywriter. Just don't do this for free for your client. So you should always charge a little bit extra in this case. Of course, if it's only about finding images, that is okay, because that is very easy and fast, but writing content is something entirely different. All right? Then, if you have a bigger website, then it is also time to plan the sitemap. So basically planning what pages the site needs and how they relate to one another based on all the content that you now have. Now, also based on the content, here you can also start planning the sections that each of the page should have in order to convey the message to the user as good as possible. And notice how I emphasized the content here a couple of times. And the reason for that is that it is the content who should guide the project and the design of the website in the end. So again, always have the content actually guide the project and the design, and do not do the opposite. So don't come up with a pretty design and a pretty website and then in the end fill it with the content. That is definitely the wrong way to go. Now finally, based on everything you already know about the company and the project and all of your content, it is now time to also define the website personality that you will want to implement in your design. And of course, this is all based on the website personality framework that we learned about earlier. So by the time you need to make this decision, you can of course go back to our web design section and then remember how you can actually make that decision. Okay, and with that, we wrap up the planning phase and can move on to the sketching phase, where we will start thinking about the components and maybe some layout patterns that we're going to need in order to convey the message of our content. And here again, keep in mind that it's the content who should guide the design and not the other way around. Now, once you have an idea about what components and what layouts you might want to use, it's time to create some sketches with pen and paper, or maybe even with some design software like Figma. And these sketches at this point should be very, very simple. So very low fidelity without any details. So you don't even have to write text or anything like that. Just like draw some boxes for the images and for the text content, just to quickly get your ideas out of your head. Because this is very, very important for your creative process. And don't worry if this sounds confusing, because I will actually show you my process in the next lecture. But anyway, this process of sketching your initial component and layout ideas is really, really important. And just two more things that you need to understand about this. And first is that this is really an iterative process. So you don't have to set anything in stone yet at this point. Just keep experimenting with different ideas for different components and layouts until you arrive at a first good solution. But then when you implement this in code, you can of course change everything up again. So that's no problem, because again, this is just to get your ideas out of your head quick. Also, you of course don't need to spend a lot of time in order to sketch everything, so your entire design at this point. And of course, also don't make it perfect, as I said previously. So maybe in some situations, you just need to sketch like half of your design, and then you're already ready to jump into HTML and CSS. So overall, this process of sketching is not rigid at all. It is quite dynamic. So you can jump between your sketches and your code, and you can try a lot of different ideas and experiment around until you arrive at what you like the most. What matters most is that you don't just start designing in code without having a general or a rough idea of what you actually want to build. All right. And speaking of building, the next step is to finally actually design and build your website. So here you finally take your plan and your content and the sketches that you did before in steps 1 to 3 and use them to design and build the project with HTML and CSS. And usually what I like to do, as I mentioned way back, is using a process called designing in the browser. So basically having just the rough sketches that I explained before and then do the actual design in code. And this designing includes, of course, to now choose and apply the actual visual styles for your design. So remember, from step 3, you already have the layout and the components. And so again, now it's time to actually implement them and to design the actual visual styles that you were going for. And of course, these visual styles need to be based on the website personality that you selected and the design guidelines that I also showed you in that section. And of course, as the third ingredient of building a good design is that you need to get a lot of inspiration before you actually style and design your page. So that's basically just what we learned in the web design section and also in the last section, right? Now, one thing that is quite common is that your client will already have some kind of branding in place. And that's especially true if you're working for a little bit bigger of a company. And so in that case, you should of course use that client's branding whenever possible. So usually for things like colors, typography, and icons, so that your web design of course matches their client's branding. So this is very, very important. And of course, it makes your life as a designer a little bit easier, because then some of these decisions have already been made. And so that is always good. And with this, I think we close up this step number 4, which of course is the biggest step of all and the most fun for sure. But again, you should not neglect the steps 1, 2, and 3, because otherwise step 4 will not be built on a solid foundation and you might not end up with the ideal solution. All right. But anyway, now let's move on to step number 5. So once you're done building your project, you need to test and you need to optimize it before you can actually launch it to the web and call it ready. And this includes a couple of steps, where the first one is to ensure that your website actually works well in all the major browsers. So in Google Chrome, in Firefox, Safari, and Microsoft Edge. But hopefully you will not have to test for the old Internet Explorer, because then most of the things that I'm showing you in this course will actually not work. So right now it is hopefully time for most of your clients to drop support for the old Internet Explorer. So if that's the case, then just ignore that, and then you can use everything that I'm showing you in this course. Next, in order to test the responsive design, we need to actually test the website on actual mobile devices and not just in our developer tools. We also need to optimize all images that we use in our website. And that means two things. First, we need to actually give them the right dimensions in pixels. And second, we need to compress them in order to not force our users to download huge images, because that is just a bad, very bad, actually, user experience. Also, we need to fix some simple accessibility problems, so things like issues with the color contrast that we actually already learned about, I think, in our design lecture. Another common thing that we usually do is to run a performance test in our Google Chrome developer tools, which is called Lighthouse. And I will show you how we do that by the end of this course, and also some of the other things that are here in this list. Finally, one important thing that you should do before launching any website is to think about search engine optimization. Now that, however, requires a whole course on itself, so that is completely outside the scope of this course here, and so we're not going to touch on that in our current project. All right, and once you have your project built and everything is nicely tested and optimized, and so in the end everything is perfect, it's finally time to share your masterpiece with the world. And so basically now it's time to launch the website to the internet. So in technical terms, what that means is to upload your website to a hosting platform. Now there are countless options here, but we will use my favorite hosting platform, which is called Netlify. And Netlify has a very nice free plan, as we will see, and so it's going to be a perfect choice here. However, uploading the website to a hosting platform is not the end of the story, because you actually also need to buy a great domain name for your project, because otherwise users will have no way of finding your website. And when it comes to actually choosing a great domain name for yourself, go with one that is memorable for your users and that is easy to write, and maybe even more importantly, one that of course represents the company or the brand that the website is for. All right, so after all this and after finally launching our website to the web, we are finally done, right? Well, except for the fact that usually we also need to maintain and updating the website. So launching the website is many times not the end of the story, because as I said, we need to actually keep the website content updated over time. Now, if you're working with a client, this can be a great chance to have some recurring revenue. So by creating a monthly maintenance contract with your client, which is something that many web developers actually do. Now, one thing that I didn't mention yet, but which is pretty important, is that you should also install some kind of analytics software. And here pretty much everyone uses Google Analytics, but there are also more privacy-focused solutions such as Fathom. And the reason why analytics is so important is that it gives you stats about your website users, which you can then use in the future to adapt your site structure and the content, and really to do all other kinds of fine-tuning of your website. And so that will then help you make it really perfect and really make it better and better over time. And finally, one aspect of many websites that needs to be kept up to date is a blog. And a blog is a great way to keep users coming back to your website, and it is also very good for search engine optimization if you use it with the right content. So if there is a blog, then of course that needs to be updated regularly, because otherwise it doesn't make sense to have a blog in the first place. And so that is one more step, or one more part of this step number 7. And with this, we actually finally reached the end of the process that stands behind building any website. So as you see, there really is a lot of things that you need to think about, and really a lot of aspects that go into building a beautiful and useful website. And so that's why I think that this lecture here is going to be really, really useful in the future when you start to build and to design your own websites. So hopefully you liked this lecture. Now, in the next one, we will actually start implementing some of these things, because we will finally start working on our big course project. So I'm very excited to see you there very soon. It's now time to start planning our big course project based on the steps that we just learned about. And so let me start by introducing you to 𝗦𝗣𝗜𝗖𝗓. So 𝗦𝗦𝗡 is a fictional startup that I invented just for this course. And what they do is to use AI to create and deliver custom healthy meal plans. But right now, before they can actually launch their product, they need a new, beautiful, modern, and clean website. So a website that will make them look like a professional and trustworthy company. And so that is where we come in, because we will do exactly that. So together, we will pretend that we were hired by 𝗦𝗦𝗡 to design and build their marketing website using HTML and CSS. So this is going to be a real world project where we're going to use all the skills that we already learned and even a lot more. So this project will be like your very first job building websites. And this is really, really cool, I think. It will be so much fun to pretend that we're actually working for a real company, right? So I hope you're as excited as I am about this project. I think this is a really cool idea and challenge, and of course, learning opportunity as well. Now, 𝗦𝗦𝗡 provides us with all the content for the website, of course. And so in order to prepare for our job now, let's take a quick look at that content. And as always, that content is in the starter files for this section. So let's come here again to our starter folder. And then here inside of this, it is this one. So 𝗦𝗦𝗡 desktop 7. And then here, all we have is this content. So again, what I will do is copy this folder here and paste it right here. So 07 𝗦𝗦𝗡 desktop. Now in your case, it is probably enough to simply call this 𝗦𝗦𝗡, and then you will simply work in this folder until the very end of the course. Here in my case, I have divided it into multiple folders because we will have multiple sections in this project. But again, you should just do it like this. Then let's create a new window here. And then I'm going to open that folder right here. And so that will then be our project folder for this project. Okay. This is something new here in VS Code. So just click on yes there. And okay. So all we have here is this folder with the content. And then in there we have this image folder, which has all the images and even some more folders with images. And then even more importantly, we have this content.md. And MD stands for Markdown, which is a special text format that we use many times in development. So just quickly about that, basically in markup, having one hash like this is for the main heading, then 2 hashes is for the secondary heading, and so on and so forth. So here we have a third one. So this is a tertiary heading. So it's a little bit like H1, H2, all the way to H6 in HTML. But anyway, here we have some short description about 𝗦𝗡𝗜𝗖𝗬 right here. Then we have some branding, so things like the headline and the brand color. So as you see, at least the design decision about the color has already been taken away from us, which is very nice. So this is helpful to already have the brand color. And then here they give us the actual content for the website. So we have some summary, and we have then here all this content that we will need. Okay. And so now I just want to ask you to please pause the video at this point and read all this content here, so that then when we start building the project, we are all on the same page. And actually the most important thing here is this one, so this description, because this one we will actually need for the rest of this lecture. Okay, so please pause the video here and read this description, and if you feel like it, it would be even better to read the entire content here. All right, so now based on this content and on the 𝗦𝗡𝗜𝗖𝗓 description, let's actually start planning our project. So what we're going to do now is to take care of step 1 and step 2 of the 7 steps behind a great website that we learned in the previous lecture. So in other words, we're going to define and plan the project a little bit here now. And beginning with defining the project, remember that here we need to define who the website is for, what it is for, and also basically establish our target audience. So the first one is very easy. In this case, this project is for a client. So the 𝗦𝗡𝗜𝗖𝗓 company in this case. Next, defining what the website is for is basically defining the user goal and the business goal. Remember? And for doing that, we can take another look at the content that 𝗦𝗡𝗜𝗖𝗓 has provided us and that we just read previously. So based on this company description, we can kind of infer that the business goal is to sell a monthly food subscription, and that the goal of the users is to basically eat well effortlessly, but without spending a lot of time and money. Now, of course, you could have used a completely different wording here, but the intention is basically this. So the business wants to sell the food subscription, and the user wants to eat well and eat healthy, right? So that's basically what this website will be for, matching the business goal with the user goal. And so, of course, as we already learned, we need to keep this in mind as we design our page. And a huge factor in that is, of course, also the content, but that is already written, right? So that makes it easier. But if you have to write the content on your own, then this aspect is actually even more important. So writing the content exactly so that in the end we have the business goal meet the user goal. Now, finally, about the target audience, we are not going to be able to make it really specific like in that example that I showed you in the last video, but we can take some clues here. So the language in this description is kind of technical and geeky. So with things like AI algorithm and AI-centric approach, and also they themselves say that they are a technology company first. And so I think it's safe to say that this product is targeted mainly at people who are into technology. So a little bit into geeky stuff like this. Also, we can read from the description that this is kind of for busy people and also for people who are interested in their health, right? Now, since they will have to pay for a monthly subscription, which is probably not that cheap, they also will have to have a well-paying job. And so in the end, we end up with this target audience of busy people who like technology, are interested in a healthy diet, and have a well-paying job. And once again, this is even more important for when you actually write the content on your own, but still, it is good to know that the website will be built for people like this. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that there won't be any users who don't fit this description, but in general, it is people like this that we are going to build this website for. All right. So that is basically defining the project in broad terms. So let's go now to step number 2. So step number 2, remember, entails planning and gathering the website content. And this one has already been done. So that's very nice. Then the second one is to plan out the sitemap, which in this case is not necessary because we will simply build a one-page marketing website for 𝗦𝗡𝗜𝗖𝗬. So there's no sitemap here needed because we have just one page. And oftentimes a page like this with only basically one page is called a landing page. Next up, we need to think about the website personality. And here, once again, we can take some clues from the 𝗦𝗡𝗜𝗖𝗓 description that we were provided. So here in the first paragraph, they immediately say that they are a technology company first, but that they also have a focus on well-being of their users, right? Now, in the previous step, we already defined also that we are looking kind of for a tech-centered target audience. And so therefore, it kind of makes sense, I think, that we will use the startup and upbeat personality. Now, because of that importance that is being placed on consumer well-being, we can also add some elements of the calm and peaceful personality. So that's a little bit where this personality usually focuses. And so I think it might be nice to add some design elements of that personality as well. But in general, I think we will mainly use the startup and upbeat personality because, well, this is in fact a startup, okay? And so now all we have to do is to plan the page sections. And so in order to do that, let's actually go back to our content because remember that we should always do this planning based on the content. So not do a pretty design without the content and then simply filling it up with content. But instead, we will have our content basically guide the design and the planning of the sections. Okay, so let's check out here the website content. And actually, this is already a little bit divided into sections. However, we can still do better. So this content that they provided us with is not yet finally divided into logical website sections. But anyway, here we have some summary and also up here this headline. And so these should probably go into some kind of header, right? So into a hero section, as we like to call it. Then we have here these features. We have how 𝗦𝗡𝗜𝗖𝗓 works. Then we have some meals and this list. But let's actually go here to the very bottom where I will create a list of the sections. Just some separation there. And then here I'm using an H2 basically. So sections. So these dashes here are basically like bullet points. So let's use those. And remember, we are going to start with a hero section. So for now, let's simply basically gather all the sections that they have here, and then we will group them into more logical sections for our page. So here they want a section with logos of featured publications. So here they have some images about that. For example, here Forbes or TechCrunch. And remember that this is something that I talked about in the components lecture, right? But anyway, there's a lot of things here, but let's start at the top. So here we have the features, then how it works. Okay, so let's add that. Let's not use the word section here all the time. So features, how it works. Let's see what else they have. Then we have diets, basically, and sample meals. And they also say that they offer a free sample meal. So here they want a simple form for users to sign up. So we can say that this is kind of our call to action section, right? And again, this is something that I talked about at length already I think in the component section or in the layout section, or actually lectures. So you can just go back there for inspiration as always, and also to see what it's all about. So again, we have the diets, the sample meals, and this is our call to action then. So diets, meals, let's just call it meals actually, because I think they're just basically showing some data about 2 meals there, and then our call to action. Right. Yeah, so they have these 2 meals and the diets, the call to action. Then we have the pricing, photo gallery, and testimonials. Okay, so pricing, gallery, and testimonials. All right. And of course, you can do this planning in some other software or even with pen and paper, which is how I like to do it. But then you couldn't really see what I'm writing, right? Okay. Then here they have that featured publications section. So this one I like to call featured in, and then some contact information and additional links. And so this is usually the kind of information that goes into the website footer. So again, that's something that I showed you in one of these lectures that were about components and layouts. So featured in and then a footer. Okay. Featured in and a footer at the very top. Okay. Now, usually before the hero, we also want some navigation. Now, even though this page is only a single page website, so a landing page, remember, we still want some kind of navigation because it can be helpful to have some links at the top, which will lead the user to different sections of the page. And that is useful because each of these sections will kind of be a mini page. So back in the day, actually, websites were made like that, where each page only had very little content, and then each of these here could actually be its own page. But now in modern design, and especially for landing pages, it's quite common to simply have a very long page where the user simply keeps scrolling. But again, a navigation can still be helpful there. Okay, so the call to action here, remember, is usually the last section before the footer. So let's move that down, again using Option and down. So we have the footer and the call to action. The featured in section, so that small part with the logos, is usually always right after the hero. Or sometimes these logos are even placed right into the hero section. But to make it simpler, we will simply put it right after the hero. And again, you can see some examples of that in the inspiration that I provided you in the layouts lecture. Okay, so that is in the previous section. Next up, here in these diets and meals, let's go up there again. So, yeah, right here. So this one here is only like a list of these different diets, and so I don't think that this deserves a section on its own. So instead, I would say that we can include this here into the section of the sample meals, because here we have just 2 meals. And so I can imagine that we could put these 2 meals side by side, and then on the side of that, so besides these 2, we could then simply display this list. So that to me looks quite logical. And so let's join these 2 together. So meals and list of diets. Okay. Now another pattern that you will see in modern landing pages is that the pricing is also quite low on the page. So many times it comes right before the call to action. So let's move that down there. All right. And so now slowly the order of the sections here is starting to make a little bit more sense. And also it starts to be more in line with what we see in modern landing pages. And teaching you that is actually yet another goal of this course. So this is really nice here. I think together thinking about the order of the sections here and how we can arrange our content in a logical and modern way. But anyway, here we have the testimonials section, right? And so again, there's not a lot of content here. So it's basically these 4 testimonials here with some photos. So, well, here we have a lot of these customer photos. And then for the gallery, we have these 12. So it's this one and then 11 others, and they're all square. So we will want some kind of gallery. And again, we actually got some inspiration on that in one of the previous sections. So actually, I think in the previous section in the lecture about components. Now, the goal of this photo gallery here will to show the user just how yummy the food looks. And so it will really try to make the user sign up for the subscription. And the same thing can be said about these testimonials. So these testimonials are all about social proof. And so they are to show the user that other users already bought the subscription and that it's worth it. And so again, this one here is a little bit about selling. And so I was thinking that we could put the testimonials and the gallery kind of side by side. So then we have on one side all of these nice testimonials that will really try to push the user over the edge of signing up. And then the gallery here can then really reinforce that and drive that point home. So let's put them side by side, because I think that can be quite powerful. So one section will be gallery plus, or actually testimonials plus gallery. Okay, and we're almost done here. There's just one more thing that I want to show you. So here in this how 𝗦𝗜𝗜𝗖𝗞𝗘 works, we have these app images. So we have these 3 different app screens, so which look like this, which is from the application of 𝗦𝗜𝗜𝗖𝗞𝗘 that they gave us. And so this will be very helpful to show us how 𝗦𝗜𝗜𝗖𝗞𝗘 actually works. So that's exactly here, these 3 steps that we have here. And by reading through these 3 steps here, I think that this section actually gives a really good impression of what 𝗦𝗜𝗜𝗖𝗞𝗘 is and how it works. So it can show the user not just how it works, but also really what 𝗦𝗜𝗜𝗖𝗞𝗘 is all about. And so I think that this is actually a better way of opening the website than simply listing these features here, which is something that many websites do. But now more and more we see that this is no longer the case in many designs. So a couple of years ago, many landing pages would start like with these 4 columns and then have one feature block for each of these features. But that looks a little bit boring, and also it's easier to scan simply these 3 steps here than to read through all these features, right? And also if we take a look at the content here, then actually this doesn't really explain and it doesn't really describe what 𝗦𝗜𝗜𝗖𝗞𝗘 is all about. And so I think that this is a little bit more secondary information, like never cook again. Okay, this is quite important. But then things like local and organic, and that they produce no waste, and that you can pause anytime. This is more, I think, secondary information. It's not that important to be like on the top of the page. And so I would open the page with this section here of how 𝗦𝗜𝗜𝗖𝗞𝗘 works and then move that down. All right. But of course, that is only my own personal choice, and it would be totally fine to do it in any different way. So obviously, all this is a little bit based on my own personal bias and my personal tastes, but I still think that these are sensible choices. And so what I'm going to do here is to move the features actually below the pricing. So we then have kind of a section which can, well, we can even add the pricing with the features like together in one section. So we can have these 2 pricing tables, and then below that we can simply have these 4 features which will then inform the user even better what they are signing up for, in case that they're interested at least. Okay, And so with this, we end up with this list of sections. Well, the navigation is not really a section, but it will be the first thing on the page together with the logo. So that is quite common. Then the hero section, then that small section just with the logos. Then that nice how it works section, which contains a lot of useful information about how 𝗦𝗡𝗜𝗖𝗓 works and even what it's all about. Then we can already show the user some of the possible meals in case they sign up. And then from here on, we are trying to sell the product. So here we are really starting in the sell mode. So we start having some testimonials and gallery to really convince the user. Then we show them how much it costs and the features of the product. And finally, then here in the call to action, we want to sign them up. Okay, so I hope that reasoning made sense to you and will help you also maybe reason about the order of your own sections once you start building your own websites at some point. Nice. So with this in place, we can actually start sketching some of these sectors in the next lecture. So hopefully I'm going to see you there soon. Now, based on the page sections that we defined in the last lecture, so in step number 2, let's now very quickly think about some components that we might need in our page and some first layout ideas as well. And remember that this is an iterative process, so you will never arrive at a perfect solution immediately, but usually only after experimenting a little bit around. Also, we don't have to think about the entire page just yet. All right? And so that's what we will do here in this lecture as well. But anyway, here we have an outline of the sections that we arrived at in the last lecture. Remember that? And so now let's, for a few of them here, think about some of the components that we might need. And so the logo and navigation we will not worry about at this point, but let's think about the hero section. So I was thinking of using a hero like this. And so this is basically one of the examples that we got in the, I think, in the layouts gallery lecture. So in the previous section. And so this is because we have a hero image that looks a little bit like this. So a hero image that we got from the 𝗦𝗡𝗜𝗖𝗓 content and which would look nice here on the right side of the hero section. So just like here. Then also in the content, we have some headline and we have also a summary. And so basically we have our content follow a little bit the example that we have here. So remember the very important principle that I mentioned a couple of times already, which is that the design and the layout must follow the content and not the other way around. Okay? And so we have a hero image that we got from 𝗦𝗡𝗜𝗖𝗓, which looks a bit like this. And so we can then use this very common form of a hero section, right? Next, we're also going to have a featured in section, and that will simply look like this, probably without the text, which we do not have, but it's simply going to be some logos, one beside the other. Then, next up, we have the how it works section, and here I was thinking of using something like this, but we do actually have a lot more content than this, especially the text is a bit longer than this one here, and so we will probably put them one after the other. So using some kind of Z pattern, for example. But I will show you the layout that I ended up with in a minute as well. But first, let's go here through the components. So next up, we have the meal section. And if we take a look at the content, there we had 2 different meals and then also a list of diets. And so for each of these 2 meals, we're going to use a card that looks a little bit like this. So basically with an image on top and then with some data about the recipe or about the meal and using some icons there as well, just like in this component right here. Finally, let's also think about the testimonials and gallery section. And so here I had the idea of putting the testimonials on one side and the gallery on the other side. And so the testimonials might look something like this. So basically this 2x2 grid, because we do also have 4 testimonials. And then on the right side, we could use a gallery like this. So a very simple gallery, just 3x4 images. And that is because we also have exactly 12 images in that folder that we got from 𝗦𝗡𝗜𝗖𝗓. So I think this could be a nice section with these two components basically side by side. All right, and putting it all together, I arrived at a layout that might look something like this. So as I said before, I like to do these sketches always by hand. And so this is exactly the type of sketch that I always make before coding any new website. And as I said also before, it is not the entire page here, but maybe something like the first half. So it's just so we get a general feeling of the overall layouts and of some of the components that we want to use for the content. Also, I would usually create a couple of different sketches just to experiment around a little bit, like I said in the beginning of this lecture. But here, of course, in this course and in this lecture, I need to keep it short. And so I'm just showing you what I arrived at. And if you still had any doubt if I was something like an artist, then this sketch should be proof that I'm definitely not an artist, right? But of course, here the quality of the drawing does not matter at all. We just want to get our ideas out of our head. And so for that, a sketch like this is perfect. But anyway, of course, here this first section is the hero section. Then here is that featured in section with these 5 logos side by side. Then next, we have the how it works section. And as I mentioned previously, we do actually have a lot more text content in our content file than we have here in this example component. And so we will put these steps here basically one after another using this Z pattern. So can you recognize the Z pattern here? So that's something, again, that we studied before in the last section, I believe. But anyway, next up, as I said, we will then have these cards here for the 2 meals that will be in the meal section. And then, of course, we will have the testimonials here on the left side in the next section, and also the gallery on the right side. And I think that this will create a really, really nice layout for this section. Okay, and yeah, for now, that's actually it. So this is our initial plan, basically, of how we will create the layout of this page. And I will discuss each of the sections, of course, in a little bit more detail as we reach them as we go through the project here. Okay, and once again, I really hope that it was helpful for you to kind of get a look at what my process is and how I do these sketches and really how I come up with layouts on my own, because this is really all that matters for me in this project. So I don't just want you to learn how to build this specific project, of course. I want you to learn how to actually come up with your own layouts based on your own content in the future. And so that's why I'm putting so much emphasis here on this planning step. I think it is really crucial, and I believe that you will experiment the same once you really have to start building some layout on your own, which hopefully will be sooner than later. But anyway, let's now finally start writing our first line of code in the next lecture. All right, so now that steps 1, 2, and 3 are completed, it's time to finally start with step number 4, which is going to be the actual design and development phase. And so in this lecture, we are going to do some quick setup in order to be able to start working on the actual website very soon. So, back in VS Code, as always, we need to start by creating our files. So index.html, and for some reason it created it inside of the index folder, but we want it outside. Okay, so if we now close this, then the index.html is clearly outside. And then we also want style.css. And for some reason it keeps creating them inside, but we can easily fix that, right? Now here we will once again scaffold or HTML, but of course, if you want to practice a little bit more, you can also write it by hand, but I will just use exclamation mark and then enter like this. And then starting with the title here, 𝗦𝗜𝗜𝗚 for now. A little bit later, we might add something there, but for now, let's call it just 𝗦𝗜𝗜𝗚. And then I also want to connect the style.css file. So remember that is link. Then here we need to specify this rel property, set it to style sheet, and then the actual path. So that's the href. And actually, I want to put this style here in a separate CSS folder this time. So we're going to have multiple CSS files and multiple image files. And so I want to create a folder for each of them. Okay. So actually, let's take everything out of the content folder and then delete it, because here we already have the image folder that we will want to be using. So let's take that out, and why not the content as well? And then this folder is empty, and so we no longer need that actually. All right, so we have our image folder as we always had, and then let's create a new folder here called CSS. And later we will then also have another folder for JavaScript, but that will be a lot later. Okay. But anyway, now here we need to specify the path to that file as always. And so that is at css-style.css. Right. Give it a first save, and that then formats the HTML here as always. And then here, let's just add the h1 element. And here we can immediately grab the content from here. Why not? So the headline of 𝗦𝗜𝗜𝗚 is this one. So let's actually use that right away. So, okay. And so for now, that's actually enough for the HTML. Let's just make sure that it works by going live right away. Now that opened it in a wrong browser for me, but I can also manually do it. So 127.0.0.1, and then it is port 5500, I think. And so here we go. So that is our HTML right there. And now let's go actually to our CSS. And here, as always, I'm going to start with the global reset. So selecting everything and then setting padding and margin to 0 in order to override the default styles of all browsers. And then also activating the border box setting in our box model. Okay. So that is our global reset as always. And just to see if the CSS is correctly connected, now all the paddings and margins should be gone here. And indeed they are. And so now let's also start adding some simple styles to the body. And I will start by setting the font family simply to sans serif. That's because for now, I don't want to choose any specific typeface yet. I think it's best that we first build a little bit of the page at least, before we can figure out which typeface is the best fit for our design and for our website personality. Then here I also like to reset the line height on the entire page to 1 and set the font weight to 400. And finally, let's set a text color to 555. So this is a gray color that I like to use a lot. So basically one of those colors which have only 3 numbers. So like 333 or 555, which is, remember, the same as this, right? So I find these quite easy to work with. And so usually I reach for one of them as my base gray color. Okay, let's just check it out here. And indeed, our CSS is already working. And so this is basically our initial CSS setup here in the code. So as I said, that's the code. And now let's think a little bit about the design. So basically taking our very first design decisions here and setting up some small design systems as well. So here I will add a big comment block, and then in there I will basically write all the design settings that we want for our overall design here. And let's start with the typography. So typography system. Now here I want to use those font sizes that we have been using in the previous section as well. So let's actually open one of the files from that. So just to copy that. So it is on my desktop, then here in components. And then let's just get the very first one. And so here we have these two systems. So just copy them and paste them here. Spacing, that's for later. So this is for the font sizes in pixels. Okay, but then the spacing system comes a bit later. Because for typography, we can actually define some more, basically defaults here. So we can also specify default font weights and also default line heights. So not really defaults, but more of commonly used settings that we use. So I like to do this here, so specifying kind of a design system so that then whenever I need something, I just have to go here to the top of my CSS file and then reach it from there. And so that will help us a lot in maintaining a consistent design across the entire page. So for example, I can say that the default line height is 1, which is what we set here. And then as we keep growing the page, we will then keep adding more and more here. Okay, let's remove that, just add a dash here, just to make it a bit more visible. And of course here too. Okay, so typography is our first design ingredient. Remember that? And so let's now go through all of them here. So the second one, remember, is colors. And we already have our primary color. So that's here in the content, right? Okay. And then remember, we also need to generate some tints and some shades, and we might also need some accent colors. So again, all of that can be found in the web design lecture on colors. So tints, which is basically darker versions, and shades, which are lighter versions, or maybe it's the other way around, I never know. Then we will also at some point define some accents and of course or grays. And the grays we already have, at least one of them. So this 555, but over time we will keep adding more of them. So let's just add some dash here again. Okay, and again we will add these here over time. So I'm not yet going to generate all the possible tints that I might need and all the possible shades because, well, I might not need them then, and so I will simply generate them as we go. Okay, so just in order to save some time, and the same of course about the accents and the gray colors. The next design ingredient is images, but for that we cannot really set up any system. So there's no values to define for images. However, I can show you where I actually got all of these images here. So remember, there's all of these different images. So like these customers, these ones here in the gallery, and well, really a ton of images. And of course, I needed to get them from somewhere. And my main source that I already mentioned also before is Unsplash.com. And as always, the link is on my resources page. And so then it's, of course, very easy. all you have to do is, for example, to search for food, right? And then whatever you need, you can just click here on this download arrow, and this will then immediately download the image, and you can then use it for free without any restrictions wherever you want. So I think this one here is actually on the gallery or something, and you will see many of these images here actually on our web page. While restaurant does not really exist. But again, there is really a ton of high quality images that are really, really nice. So this one here, remember, was actually the background image for the header that we built in the last section. And it is also very important in this project because here we have this hero image that I created. So it's made out of these 3 images. And one of them is, again, this beautiful image here of this women eating some food. Okay, and so yeah, this is how I got these images. Then, as for the customers, there is a very nice page or website which is called UI Faces. So this one here, and here you can download all of these faces basically completely for free, and just as the images from Unsplash, you can just use them wherever you want and free of charge, of course. So that's where I got those, and I think that's it. These other ones, so these app screens here, I actually designed them completely on my own, basically based on the design of our site here. Next up, there would be icons, but again, there's not really anything to specify there. So let's go to the next one, which is shadows. So here we might at some point define some rules for shadows, or basically some standard that we want to repeat over and over again, because just with all the other design ingredients, it looks a lot better if we stay consistent throughout the design and don't use, for example, 2 very similar shadows, but which are not exactly the same. So for now, there's nothing here, but a bit later there might. Then the same for border radius, which is the next ingredient. So here we will also a little bit later specify something. And finally, or last design ingredient that matters here is white space. And so here we now have this spacing system. So that system that we are going to use. And well, I guess that's actually it. So that's the only thing we can specify here for white space. And so I think that's it for now. And again, we will keep filling this up as we go. Now here we can actually also say that the default that we already set before is 400. And then we will, again, keep adding more. All right, very nice. So with this, we have basically everything in place to finally start coding and start building this project. Now, just one more thing that we need to learn about before is a little bit about responsive design. That's because the responsive web design principles need to be applied from the very, very beginning of a project. And up until this point, we never cared about this, but now we are building a real world project. And so then, of course, we need to make it responsive from the very beginning, make it adapt to all screen sizes. And so therefore, let's now quickly learn the basics of responsive web design. Since we're building a real-world website, we need to think about responsive web design principles from the very beginning, even if we initially build and test for big screens. So these principles are really ingrained in the entire development process. And so therefore, before we actually start building the site, let's quickly learn what responsive design is all about. So responsive design, or responsive web design, as it's been more traditionally called, is essentially a technique that we can use to make a web page adjust its layout and its visual style to any possible screen size. And with screen size, we don't just mean the entire screen of the device that it's been used to consume the page, but it might also just be the window or the viewport size of the browser. So in practice, this means that responsive web design makes websites usable on all devices. So no matter if you're using desktop computers, tablets, or a mobile phone, a responsive website will be easily consumable on all of these devices. Now, it's important to understand that responsive web design is not a separate technology. So instead, it is really just a set of best practices and of techniques that we use in our regular CSS. Okay? And speaking of this set of best practices and techniques, let's now actually learn about them. So there are essentially 4 big ingredients to responsive designs. And those are fluid layouts, responsive units, flexible images, and media queries. Now there might be more, and they might be classified differently, but these are really the big and important ones that you need to know. And so let's start with fluid layouts, which basically allow the web page to adapt to the current viewport width. And this is a behavior that we have already seen in practice a couple of times, especially when we used Flexbox and CSS Grid, which are fluid by default. All right. And we can very easily create fluid layouts simply by using the percentage units for all elements that should adapt to the viewport. So using percentages instead of pixels for all the elements that are usually part of any layout. So things that should really adapt to the viewport should always use percentages and not pixels. Also, we should always use the max width property instead of simply width. And we will learn a little bit about how this one works in the next lecture. Next up, there are responsive units, which basically just means that we should use the rem unit instead of pixel for most of the length that are in our CSS. And using rems instead of pixels will make it really easy for us to basically scale the entire page up or down automatically. And if that sounds a little bit strange, I can show it to you in the next lecture as well. Now here, one helpful trick that I will also show you how to implement in the next lecture is to set one rem to 10 pixels, because that makes it very easy for us to then calculate these length. And again, more about that in the next video. The next ingredient are flexible and fluid images. And this is a separate and important ingredient because by default, images behave different than text content because they do not scale automatically as we change the viewport. Therefore, we need to fix that. So we need to ensure that they do also adapt nicely to whatever viewport the page is viewed at. And usually we simply make images flexible by defining their dimensions in percentages and not using pixels, and also sometimes by using the max width property instead of width. So this one sounds trivial and not important, but actually flexible images is yet another important ingredient of responsive web design. And now, finally, media queries is what brings all the other ingredients together and really brings responsive sites to life. So without media queries, responsive web design would not work at all. And that is because media queries allow us to change styles on certain viewport width, which we call breakpoints. So basically, media queries allow developers to create different versions of a website for different types of devices, because different types of devices have a different width. Now, just keep in mind that media queries alone are completely useless. We really need to start creating a fluid layout from the very beginning. And the same is true for responsive units and flexible images. And in fact, we usually write media queries only at the end of building a certain page or a certain component. And so that's why we will use fluid layouts and responsive units and flexible images in this section, but then media queries, we will only use them in the next section to really make this page responsive. All right. Now, just as a side note, of course, I'm not showing you all of this to scare you or to make you memorize all this information. So this slide is more like a reference for you in the future and also for us to guide us through this project. All right. Now, finally, we also need to talk about the two opposite strategies of building responsive sites with CSS. So the first one is the desktop-first approach, in which we optimize our interfaces for large screens. And so, therefore, we start writing CSS code for these large screens into our main CSS file. Then later, when we actually want to make the website responsive, we simply write media queries in order to shrink the design to fit to smaller screens. This is the more traditional way of doing things, and it's also the easier way to learn, in my opinion. And so, therefore, that's the reason why we will actually use the desktop-first approach in this project. Now, on the other hand, in mobile-first, we start writing CSS code for smaller screens in order to basically optimize our layout and our website for mobile small screens. Then, from there, we can move up to larger screens, of course, and again using media queries. So basically, it is the complete opposite of desktop first, right? Now, the idea that's behind this strategy of mobile first is that we, as the designer, really have to think about the mobile experience for our users. And basically, we can do that by reducing our website to the absolute essentials and stripping away everything that is not entirely necessary. And since we live in a mobile world now, this has actually become the more modern way of building websites these days. But again, doing desktop first works just as fine, I think, and it is also way easier for me to show you as a beginner how web development works. So basically how CSS and HTML works with really seeing the results in a large screen. Okay, and that's it. That's basically a short introduction into responsive web design. And so now in the next lecture, we will quickly learn about two of the ingredients a little bit better in CSS. So we're going to learn how the rem unit works and also the max width property. In order to be able to effectively implement the responsive web design ingredients that we learned about in the last lecture, we now need to quickly learn about how the rem unit and how the max width property work. And let's actually start with the max width property. So here in our HTML, let's quickly create a div element with the class of test. And then let's select that. And to start, I will simply define the width property as 1000 pixels. So just to see what happens. Also, we should give it some background color of red, let's say, and also to see it a bit better, a padding of 100 pixels. Okay, so that's 1000 pixel wide. But now watch what happens when I decrease the screen. So the element stays the same, which we can see by these vertical scroll bars that we have now. So you can now basically scroll vertically here because, of course, this element here still has 1000 pixels. And so, therefore, the browser then needs to create additional space here, basically in the viewport. And so that's why we can scroll vertically like this. Okay. However, let's say that we don't want that to happen. And instead, the behavior that we want to see is that when there's no more additional space to fit these 1000 pixels here, then the element should simply have the width of the parent container. And so that's exactly what we can use the max width property for. So let's comment this one out. and now say max width. So again, I'm using 1000 pixels here, and never mind about using still pixels, even though I said we shouldn't use them for a fluid layout, because here we are simply working with this property and learning how it works. Okay, let's start again with the big viewport. So now everything looks the same. We can even inspect this here. And so we see that it is still 1000 pixels wide. But now watch what happens as we approach basically the end of the element. So now we don't see anything happen, but if we try to scroll vertically, you see that it doesn't work. And if we hover now, we see that the element only has 912 pixels. And if we go even more narrow, then it becomes even smaller. So here we see that now it is only 455. Well, that's actually not the actual width. So it is now 655 pixels, right? So basically that's the width of the parent container, which in this case is simply the body. So the body has the same width now as this element. All right. And so this basically immediately makes this element here, this test element, flexible, because now it very simply adapts to the viewport width, right? Now, you might have thought that maybe we could have used percentages for this as well, but actually that would not have the effect that we were looking for. So a percentage would not have worked because up until 1000 pixels, so like this, we actually want the element to be exactly 1000 pixels wide. So not any percentage of the viewport. Only once we reach a width here that is less than the actual width of the element, so only in that situation, we actually want this width here to adapt to the parent element. So basically occupying 100% of the width of the parent element. All right. And so that is how max width works. And compressed into just one sentence, we can say that if the container width is larger than the specified max width, then the width of the element is equal the value that was specified for max width. However, if the container width is less than the specified max width, then the width of the element will be 100% of the container element width. Okay, so take note of that summary, and then hopefully you will never again forget this important property here. So take note of what I just said, and then hopefully you will never again forget this very important property here. Okay? But anyway, let's now move on to the rem unit. Now, what does rem mean? Or what does it stand for? Well, rem is the root element's font size. So that sounds quite strange indeed, but actually it is quite straightforward. So the root of the document is the HTML element. So basically the parent element of all the others, right? Now, if we don't define any font size on this HTML element, so which is again the root element, then one rem is simply equal to the default browser font size, which is always 16 pixels, unless the user does actually change it. So let me actually demonstrate that to you here. And again, using the same example. So I'm going to use max width again. So let's say 500 rem. Okay, so what do you think the width here will be? Well, remember that by default, 1 rem is equal to 16 pixel, right? And again, that's because we did not specify any font size on the HTML element, and so therefore the default font size of 16 is taken. So 1 rem equals 16 pixels. And so therefore, here, this 500 rem will be, well, let's do the calculation. So 16 times 500, so 8,000. No, and actually I just wanted 50 rem. So 50 rem would be 800 pixels, right? So let's give it a save, and then let's go check it out. And so here we can immediately see right here that it has a width of exactly 800 pixels, right? And so that works. Now, you might find it strange that we define length in our design based on some font size, right? But actually, that is exactly where the strength of the rem unit lies, because then we can simply change the font size on the HTML element, and that will then automatically change all the length that are defined anywhere in our CSS with the rem unit, right? So let me give you some more example here. So let's just give this here some white color and give it a font size. So let's say 10 rem, or well, maybe just 2 rem actually. So 2 rem will be 32 pixels, right? So let's check out, and indeed, that's right. Also, here we have another unit. Let's move that down. And this one we can also specify in rem. Here, let's say 4 rem. And so 4 rem would be 64 pixels, right? So let's confirm all that. So indeed, we have 64 pixels here of padding. Then the width is, again, as we see, 800 pixels. And then as for the font size, here it is specified, of course, in rem. But I showed you before that we can come here to the computed tab. And if we then change for font size here, it will actually be the real one in pixels. So as it is displayed on the screen. So here it's already converted to pixels, right? Because in the end, before elements can be displayed on the page, all the relative units, such as percentages or rems, needs to be converted back to pixels. Okay? And so here we see that it is indeed 32. Okay, but now let's say that on the HTML element, right here, we set the font size to just 10 pixels. And so then 1 rem will no longer be 16 pixels, but it will instead be 10 pixels. And so these 500 rem that used to be 800 pixels, remember that? So that's what we had before, but now not anymore, because now 1 rem will be 10 pixels, and so 50 rem will be 500 pixels. And the same will happen here. So this will now be only 40 pixels, and the font size only 20 pixels. And so if we take a look at this now, then you see that basically the entire design, which in this case is really small, but still, the entire design here shrank down basically by a factor of 62.5%. And that's because 10 divided by 16 is 62.5%. But that percentage doesn't really matter here. What matters is that by changing the font size, we can completely change the entire layout. So if we try to double it, then of course everything will get really big. Right, so now this element is 1000 pixels, or at least it should be. Yes, it is. And the text should be exactly 40 pixels, because 2 times 20 is 40, and the same for the padding. So now it is 80 pixels, right? And so maybe you can start to see why this will be really, really handy when we build responsive layouts. Because, for example, when we have a smaller screen, then we want all the length to be a little bit smaller. And then instead of having to change all of these values here using media queries, we can simply change the font size up here in the HTML, and that will then shrink everything down a little bit. Okay, great. Now, one useful trick, as I mentioned in the last lecture, is to set the font size here to 10 pixels, because then it is very easy to do the calculations. So then we know immediately that this one here will be 500, this is 40, and this is 20, right? And so this is the way to go. Setting the font size here to 10 pixels, okay? Because again, then 1 rem will be exactly 10 pixels, which is very easy to do calculations with. However, this is still not perfect, because by doing it like this, we will not respect the user's definition of the browser's font size. So let's say that the user changes the default from 16 pixels to 20. Then of course they would expect that the font size on our page would increase, right? But with this setup right here, that would actually not happen. So no matter what the user would set the font size to now, we would always have our default font size, or actually our root font size here, at 10 pixels, right? And so this would create huge usability problems for users who for some reason have to increase or even to decrease the font size of their browsers, okay? And so in order to avoid that, we will not set the font size to a fixed value like this, but instead to a percentage of the default font size of the browser. So let's comment this one out. And instead, we will set the font size to 62.5%. And so let me explain you where that value comes from. So we want our font size to be 10 pixels, right? However, the default is 16 pixel. And so we can simply divide 10 by those 16 pixels, which will be 0.625, which is 62.5%. And so that's exactly this value here, right? So this percentage here is a percentage, let me write that here also, percentage of users' browser font size setting. All right. And so again, if it is set to the default of 16, then you see that 16 times 0.625 actually needs to be a comma in my case. So that is then exactly 10. All right. However, if for some reason the user needs to change it to 18, well, then the font size increases to 11.28, right? And so by using this technique, we did actually respect the user's font size setting. Okay. And the same way, if they set it like to 12 for some reason, then our default font size on our page, so 1 rem, will then be 7.5, which in turn will make it so that the entire layout is scaled down a little bit. Right? So I hope that made sense. And in fact, many web designers and CSS developers use exactly this trick. So it wasn't just me who came up with this strange looking technique, but indeed it is something that is used widely in the CSS developer community. Okay, and indeed, just to show you that it works, here our font size is still at 20 pixels, and the padding at 40, and the width at 500. All right, and all of that dynamically, because we are, again, respecting the browser's font size setting that the user chose for their particular case. Okay, and so now we know how the max width property works and how rem works. And so from now on, we will no longer use pixels, but we will always use rems. And we will simply use that trick where 1 rem is 10 pixels. And so that is then very easy to do calculations with. Nice. So hopefully all of that made sense to you, because it is important that you understand this before moving on. So make sure that you do understand it, and then let's go to the next lecture where we will actually and finally start building the 𝗦𝗡𝗜𝗖𝗓 project. So I can't wait to see you there. Welcome back to the next lecture where we will now finally start building our 𝗦𝗡𝗜𝗖𝗓 project. And we're going to start with the hero section. And for that, I already created this sketch here. So as I mentioned before, we will create this layout where we have the hero image on the right side and then the content such as the headline and some description on the left side. So exactly like these two examples that I have selected from our layout gallery lecture. Now on top of this section, there is kind of this logo and the navigation bar, but this is something that we will do a bit later. So it's actually not part of the hero itself, but it's kind of part of the start so of the beginning of the website. And so that's why I put it here as well. Now also, we will add this small component that I have highlighted in red here in the bottom, which is these customer photos and then with some relevant data. So that was not in the sketch before, but now here I have it, and you will see that it makes sense with the content that we have. Okay, and so now let's actually start building this hero section in VS Code. And let's start by removing what we did previously. Okay, and now I want to show you a very nice and important trick, which basically will allow us to have the HTML and the CSS files opened at the same time, side by side. So to do that, I will open again the CSS file, and then I can click here on this icon. So this one that says split editor right. Now, if you cannot see it, you can also do the same thing here in view and then editor layout. So you can then choose one of these options here, but usually I just click here, and then that will open this exact same file here on the right side. Okay, then I can close it here, and then to give ourselves some more space, we close down the sidebar, and that's it. So here we usually need more space for the HTML, and yeah, I think that's perfect. And so now we can basically work on both files at the same time. All right, but now about our actual hero section here, let's indeed use a section element, which basically represents a generic part of any document. So let's use section here and then give it the class of section hero. So I usually like to give all my sections then a class name which also starts with section. So that then makes it easy to identify, right? So we talked about section, so the section element before, and it is a little bit similar to the article element, but the article is more self-contained, basically. So for a section to exist, there should usually be multiple sections which are then part of something bigger, all right? So let's then, well, let's move that in later. For now, let's actually keep going. And so now I want to create the two boxes, which will then contain on the right side the image and on the left side the text content. So let's create a div element for that, which remember is simply like a box which has no semantic meaning at all. So I'm going to call this one the hero text box. And that is the one that will contain, among other elements, this h1 here. And then we also want the hero image box. So hero image box, and then we can immediately actually put the image in here. So that is in the folder img, then slash, and then it is our hero image. Now you see that it worked because it's already right here. Okay, but now let's keep going and add some more content here. So our content, of course, is here in the MD file. So this is the one that we already have, so the headline. And then here is this summary, basically. So let's just copy all this text. Then I'm going to call this one the hero description. And there we go. Here let's also add a class for heading primary. Okay, because then later we will have some classes also for the secondary and the tertiary headings. So the h2 and the h3 elements. And of course, we could simply select the h1 using this h1 element selector, right? But actually, I like to always select all the elements using classes. So no ID selectors and no element selectors. Everything will always be selected using classes, because that will give our CSS code a lot more consistency. Okay, so we have the heading, then we have the description, and now we also want 2 buttons here below this. So just like in that layout pattern example that we saw at the beginning of this lecture. And for that, I'm actually going to use an anchor element, so a link basically, because links are for going somewhere on the page or going to some other page, while a button element should only be used for actions. So if something happens that is not related to navigation, basically. So here for now, we will create an empty link. Okay. And then let's see if in the content we have some text to put on the button, but actually there is nothing. And so these types of small text, so just a small piece of text, we usually call microcopy. And many times we have to come up with those as we design and build the websites ourselves. Now this button here is going to be the main call to action button of this page. And so let's now think what we could write there. So the main action that we want the user to take here is to basically subscribe to the 𝗦𝗜𝗜𝗖𝗓 subscription, right? And so here we should write something related to that. And since the focus of this company is all on like healthy eating and things like that, we can simply write here, start eating well, for example. Okay. And it could be, of course, anything similar, but it should be like a specific action. So it wouldn't be really helpful to just write here, sign up now or buy now or something like that. So that doesn't sound so nice. And so instead, we want a very specific action like this, which makes the user feel better immediately. So start eating well, I think, is a lot more compelling than like sign up now or subscribe now. Right? Then here just adding the button class. And now besides that, we want another button, which is usually like a secondary button, which is going to be a secondary button. And this is usually used for something like getting additional information. So a popular text here is simply learn more. And then we can add some arrow here as well. So using an HTML entity, and we already used R, and then I think this here, which is the right arrow. Yeah, you can see it there in the tooltip. But then we also have DR, which stands for down arrow. And again, it's visible now there in the tooltip. And so this makes a bit more sense in this case. Okay, and with this, I think we are ready to check out what we have already. And as always, the image is really big. And so remember that we need to make it flexible now. So that's one of the ingredients of responsive web design. Remember that? Then here's also the rest of the content. And so let's now start styling this a little bit, and actually starting with the layout. So putting these 2 boxes here side by side. So one with the image and one with this text. Okay. Now for doing this, I'm actually going to use CSS Grid, even though it's actually more like a one-dimensional layout. So it's really just a row, but I'm still going to use CSS Grid because it makes it really easy to have equally sized columns. And also because I like to use the same tool for layout across the entire page. And later, of course, we are going to use CSS Grid for some other layout stuff. And then, yeah, as I said, I like to just use the same thing everywhere. All right. But even if we used Flexbox instead of CSS Grid, we would still need some container element for these 2 boxes. So the image box and the text box, right? So that grid container could, of course, be this section hero here, right? But then if we were to choose this one as the container, then we couldn't create a fixed sized container like we want to. Okay, so let's actually create another element here. So one that I'm going to call a hero. And if this doesn't make a lot of sense right now, it will make sense in a minute once you actually see what I'm talking about. Okay. So again, this hero here will actually be our CSS grid container. So let's select that. And now you can see how handy it is to have these two panels here side by side, right? So display grid. And now, as I said, we will make two equally sized columns. So grid template columns, remember. And so here we just need to give them the same value. And so usually that's 1 FR and then another 1 FR. So 2 fractional units right there. And so with this, they should now be side by side. And indeed they are, but they do not have the same size, right? And the reason for that is this huge image, which is still not really flexible. So before we do anything else, let's actually fix that. And so here, let's give it a class name. So it's the hero image. Oh, and actually we need to add the alt text as well. So never forget to do that. And so here, let's say that it's a woman enjoying food, but that's not all. There's also meals in storage, container, and footballs on a table. So a really descriptive alt text here, but that's really nice for people who cannot see these images, or also remember for search engines. Yeah, and now selecting the image with the class we just gave it. All we have to do now is to give it a width of exactly 100%, because 100% will then fill the entire parent element, which is this hero image box here, which is exactly one of the two columns of the grid. And so that column will have half the size of the grid container. And so then the image, of course, will also have half the width of the container now. Okay, and if we resize this here, then you see that indeed the image does resize as well. And so it is already, at this point, a flexible image. Okay, but now let's actually do what I mentioned to be the reason why we need this hero element here, which is to give it a fixed width. Right. So remember that we used to use the width property for that. And I'm going to give it 1300 pixels. But remember from the last lecture that we will no longer use pixels now, right? And remember what instead we use? Well, we use the RAM unit, which before we set one RAM here to being exactly 10 pixels, right? And so here we do not want 1300 pixels, but we want 130 RAM, right? So that's one thing that we needed to fix here. And the other one is actually this width property, because what happens like this, and let's actually give it some background color here. So just some random color here. And so now let's decrease this a little bit. And well, just as I mentioned in the last lecture, now of course this element does not adjust to the viewport, so to its parent element. And so therefore we then create these vertical scroll bars, which is of course not what we envision for a real world website. And so indeed what we want is max width, right? And so now when the element is larger than the container, it will simply occupy 100% of it. And so you see that this starts to look quite nice, right? So quite real world, at least. And so then once it becomes larger than the specified width, then it simply stays here. Okay. Let's get rid of this. And then of course we also want to center it in the viewport. And for that, we're actually going to use our old trick of margin 0 auto. Okay. And so this is starting to look like a usable layout that we can now improve upon. And so let's do that next and take a small break now. Let's now start adding some more visual styles to our hero section. And let's start by styling the text. So our primary heading here and our hero description. So just copying that. Let's put it here. And for now, I'm simply putting all the styles here one after another. So first of all, let's select a font size. And so let's go to our list of options. And let's try to go maybe with this 61 here. So 61 pixels, which remember means 6.2 rem. And so again, we will now use the rem unit to really size everything on our page. So all the length, like this one here, and all the font sizes as well. Okay, then let's make it bold by giving it a font weight of 700. And then let's check it out here. And that looks huge. So that's probably a bit too big. And there's also a bit too much space between the lines here. So we used 62 pixels. So let's go one down to 52. So 5.2 rem. And then the line height, let's set it to 1.1. Okay. So that looks a little bit better. And well, let's increase it actually even more to 1.05. And also let's make it darker. So we have all our text at 555, and this one we will make 333. So another gray color. So let's add that here to our palette, let's say. And yeah, and I will talk a little bit more about these colors a bit later on. So the reason why we chose them, and we might also experiment a little bit with other colors, but for now, just follow what I'm doing here. Okay, then let's try the hero description. So as always, changing the font size, of course. Here, let's try to go with 20 pixels maybe. So 2 rem. And here we can use a little bit more line height as well. Okay, nice. Maybe a little bit more line height even. And then of course, we finally need some spacing here as well. So we need some spacing here. So after the H1, and then some spacing here after this paragraph, right? And remember that we're still iterating with our design here. So we're just trying out here things a little bit for now, because actually we don't even have yet a font family selected, right? And so we can tweak all of this later. We just need some starting base here from which we can then improve, okay? For example, I can actually see here in this heading that we should probably decrease the letter spacing, because this text here is very large, and as we learned in one of the design rules, many times it then looks unnatural with the big spacing between the letters. And here that is actually the case, so let's remove that a little bit as well. So let's say half a pixel, so minus 0.5 pixels. And here notice how I'm not using rem, and that's because this is just a very small distance here, and it's also a distance that we don't really need to scale up or down. And so then we can simply keep using pixels in those situations. So here I said I was going to increase this a little bit, and now let's think about our spacing. So after the H1, let's add like 32 pixels. And then after the paragraph, a little bit more. So maybe 48 here. And so that's because the heading and the paragraph belong kind of together. And then after that, we want more space between the buttons because they are a bit separated from these two text contents. So, as I said, here we're going to use a margin bottom of 32 pixels. So 3.2 rem. And then here I'm going with 4.8 rem. So 48 pixels. Okay. Nice. So this one looks a bit more natural now with the decreased letter spacing. And here we have some nice spacing going on as well. Now let's just quickly vertically center this content here. So all of this, what's in this box. And that should be fairly easy, right? Because remember that we are using a grid. And so on the grid container, we can simply, as always, use align items and set it to center. Okay. Nice. But of course, then we have some problem with the spacing here. And so let's now actually tackle all of the spacing in this section. So of course, there's also no spacing here, kind of between the beginning of the page and this hero image. So this entire section here. And so let's now indeed think a bit more about the visual style of this section, which includes not only the spacing, but also the colors. So remember that we're using the startup website personality here. And in that personality, it's quite common to have very light background colors in some of the sections. So usually that is using a gray color. But here in this design, we actually also want to include some elements of the calm personality. Remember that? And so I think it would be nicer to not use a gray color, which is a little bit colder, but actually use a very, very light shade or a tint. Maybe I don't remember which one it is, but basically a very light version of our primary orange color. So let's get that color here. So I'll copy this hex code and then remember about this tool that I mentioned to you, which is the tints and shades generator. And as always, this link here will be on my resources page, but the one that I like to use is this one. So make_tintsandshades.com. So we just come here, then paste the code here, and then simply make tints and shades. And so here we now get these 10 shades, so the darker versions, and then all of these lighter versions. So it starts basically at the color that we selected and goes all the way to white here, and here it starts at our selected color and goes all the way to black, right? And so let's now choose this very first color here as our background color, just to see if that looks nice. So we can click here, that will then copy it. And so let's try that. So we want this entire hero section, right? So not just the hero. Let me first put that here so that you can see why we don't want it just here. Right. So that would look quite strange because usually what we see is that the entire section from left to right has the background color, right? And so here we have actually one more reason why we needed this hero container element inside of the hero section. So, or actually the section hero. So let's move that up here by hitting Alt or Option up, give it a save, and well, I think that this looks quite nice. If we went with a darker color like this one here, then I think it would look like too dark. So the contrast would be too high. Yeah. So you could go with this one, but yeah, I honestly prefer the little bit lighter version. So let's just keep it like this. And I will now copy it here and basically add it to our color palette here. So for now we just have this tint, but probably we will have more a bit later on. Okay, and now we need to add some spacing here. So we want space inside of this element, not outside of it. So in order to preserve the background color, basically. So when we have background color, we always use padding. And so top and bottom, we want a lot of space, because this is basically now the space that's between sections. And so here we want a lot of space. So, well, maybe not this much, but 96 pixels, I think will look good. And this is also the value that we used in our other project. So let's go with that. So 9.6 rem top and bottom. And then on the sides for now, we need nothing. And then, since we're talking about spacing here, let's add the exact same space also inside of the grid. So as the gap between these columns. So that's gap. And then for consistency, I'm going to use the exact same value here. All right. Yeah, beautiful. So this is starting to look like something, right? Now, here we can now style these buttons maybe as a next step. I think that would be a good idea. So that's the button class here. So let's just put that here. And actually, since this is a link and not an actual button element, we need to actually style these pseudo classes. So button link and button visited here at the same time. Let's give it our primary color as a background. So that's where the branding of the client comes in. And so this is one design decision we don't have to take, fortunately. Then the font size, let's put it at 2 rem, so 20 pixels. As for the text color, let's also make it white, so FFF. Then let's take care of the padding. And remember, this is an inline element, and so in order for the padding to work as expected, we need to make it an inline block so that the box model applies as usual. So this is something that we have done multiple times already, right? And so here I'm going to go with 16 pixels top and bottom, and 32 pixels, so 3.2 rem to the left and right. So once more, here I like to use double the size on the sides than on top and bottom. Okay, and then let's experiment with some border radius here, maybe 15 pixels. And of course, we are forgetting the text decoration, and the border radius, I think, looks a little bit too much. Now we could, of course, also make it really big. Let's just see what that looks like. Let's just remove the text decoration here very quick. And as I said, we need to make it an inline block as well. So display I like to use at the very top. Inline block. Okay. So here we have the completely rounded corners, right? But for some reason, I don't really like it in this design. And we might circle back to it a little bit later, but for now, I just want to make them really like a lot smaller. So let's say 9 pixels here. And yeah, that's actually a lot better. Okay, now there is just one problem here, which is that right now, these two buttons here do have exactly the same color, right? But that is not exactly what we want, because now both of these buttons are competing for the user's attention. However, only this one here is important, and this one is a lot less important. And so we only want this one here to be orange, and this here should be a bit more invisible, so to say. So the focus or the emphasis should really lie on our main call to action button and not on this one. And so here we need two different styles. And So what I will do is to, of course, leave this one orange, and then we can make this one white, because with this background color here, that should then look quite nice. So let's add here what I call a modifier class. And once again, we have done this multiple times already, which is to basically define the common styles in the button, so just in this, and then we can add some more specific styles to this button full class, and then also here to this other button, which I'm calling button outline. Okay? So let's see what I mean by that. So button full, and of course I could have called it also button CTA for call to action, or really any other thing, but this one will have the full background color, and so that's why I like to call it full. And then again, we need all these different pseudo classes. Right. And so now what is actually specific to this one here? Well, it is the background color. Right. So let's put that one here. And then let's just copy this to make it a bit easier. So the outline should be white. Okay. Nice. Except that we cannot see the text here. And so that's because the white text is also specific to this one. And then here we want to have the darker color. So then we will get the default color of 555. Well, actually we don't. So we get this blue default link color. And so let's set that here as well. And now let's actually worry about our hover states here. So this button here, when we hover it, we want to make it a little bit darker. And this other outline button here, we can actually give it the same background color as the rest of the section when it's hovered. Okay, so let's just copy this here. And so here, let's say hover and active. So how do we get the darker color? Well, we actually already generated it. So it's right here. And so the darker colors are these ones here. And so let's simply get this next one here, which is just a tiny bit darker, but it should be enough. So let's copy that. And yeah, here we don't need this. And let's do the same right here. So hover. And here the background color that we want is this one. Oh, and here we don't need this. And let's see. Nice. So it gets darker as intended. And here the button kind of disappears now. So this does actually look a little bit unnatural. So we should add maybe some kind of white border here around this button. And that's actually harder than it sounds like. So let me show it to you. So let's just try to add a border of 3 pixels solid white. So just like this. And you see what happens. The border kind of gets added to the outside. And so then when we hover it, the entire layout jumps a little bit. Right? Can you see that? And so of course, we don't want that. So what we need basically is to add the border to the inside of the button. Okay. And for that, we can use a trick that I'm going to show you now, which is actually not using the border property, but the box shadow property. So that sounds strange. So this trick, let me actually write it down here to add border inside. And so we use box shadow without any offset in any direction, so not horizontally and not vertically. We also don't want it to have any blur, right? But we want to scale it basically by 3 pixels. So that's basically the same 3 pixels that we had here in the border. And then finally, we again simply make the color white, just as we did here. Okay. So like this, it would basically create the same effect as here. And so let's add the missing piece here, which is the inset keyword. So with this inset keyword, the shadow will basically be added to the inside of the element. So exactly what we want. And it would be helpful if we had this inset keyword on the border actually, but we don't. So we cannot do that. So we need to use this box shadow trick to basically replicate the border and then put it inset. And so with this, you see that we now achieve this nice looking effect here. Okay. Now, right now, these hover effects here, they don't look really nice and really professional, because if we were to go to a real world website and hover over some button, then we would actually see a nice animation from one color to the other. But that's not at all what we have here, right? Here it simply jumps basically from one color directly to the other one. And so now let me show you yet another trick in which we can fix that. So basically create a nice animation using just CSS. So to do that, we basically come to the element, so to the rule which has the original state. And so that is in this case simply this link and visited, right? So this is the state before any hover. And so here we can now add the transition property. So transition property is a property that allows us to do just what it says. So to transition between two values using an animation. Then here we can specify multiple things, but at least we need 2 things. We need the property that we actually want to animate, and we need to say over how much time we want the animation to happen. Now in this case, we want to animate both the background color and the color, right? Now in this case, we want to animate both the background color and the color, right? And so we can actually just say all. And so with this, all the properties will be animated. Okay. And then again, over how many times we want the animation to happen. And so let's just start here with 1 second. So here we can choose S for second, or we could also specify milliseconds. So that would be for 1 second, 1000 milliseconds. But I like to always use seconds. That's a bit more natural. And so let's see what happens now as we hover over the button. And you see that it nicely changed the color here over 1 second. You see that? And the same is now happening here. Now, of course, this is way too slow, but this was just to show you the effect. To make it even a bit more visible, let's put the hover state to another color. Let's say red as my favorite color here. All right. And you see that changed over 1 second. And here, of course, it's still the same. Okay. And I noticed that actually we are only changing the background color and not the color. And so here we could also have written this. So instead of all, we can say just background color. Right? Then here we could also specify a third value to change the type of the animation, but that is a little bit more complex, so I'm going to leave that for later. Okay? So here I just wanted to introduce you to this brand new CSS property, so at least brand new for you, because it's been around for some years. But for you, it is a new property, and it is actually a really exciting one, because it allows us to do animations in a very, very simple way. And with animation here, basically what we mean is to change the value of a certain property or of multiple properties from one value to another one. So in this case, that is from this background color to this one here. All right. And remember, we always put the transition here on the original state. I'll actually write that down here for you. So state is not really a correct CSS term, but I think you know what I mean there. Now here, 1 second is of course way too long, so let's use a better value. And something that is commonly used is 0.3 seconds. So that's 300 milliseconds. And so with this, we have a nice and snappy animation, which feels quite natural. Beautiful. Now there's just one more thing that we need to fix, which is the space here between these buttons. So this is of course not enough space that we have here. So this doesn't look natural at all. And so we need to add some spacing here between those two. Now, how should we do this? I mean, this button full here should probably be reused in a later point on this side. And so therefore, I will not simply add a margin to the right here in this element. Right? I mean, of course, I could do this, like 1.6 rem, and that would then work quite nicely, right? But then if I added this button here somewhere else on the page, that would also get the same margin right. And so that's not what we want. Now another option here would to wrap these two buttons into some grid container or some flex container and then add some gap into that one, right? But that seems like a bit too much work here. So that's also not what I want. But instead, what I'm going to do here is to add a special helper class to this button here. So let me just write it and then I will explain what this is. So I'm going to call it margin right and SM for small. Okay. And so this will be like a reusable and very generic helper class that I can now define in my CSS and then add to multiple elements to give them some space on the right side. So let's say 1.6 rem. Okay. And so now here it looks exactly the same as before, but we achieved that using this technique of using a helper class like this. Okay. Now, when we use a helper class like this, we really want the style that it has to be applied. And no matter what other styles are already on the element. So in order to ensure that, we usually then add the important keyword here. Because remember, that then makes sure that this style here, so this declaration here, always has the highest priority. So in this case, that wouldn't be necessary, but that's just a good practice to do. Okay? And with experience, you will of course then know when you should use a class like this. And also I will show you a couple more use cases throughout this project. But many times it is actually related to margins that we want to reuse in multiple places, but that we do not want to add to specific elements. Because then when we want to reuse them somewhere else, it might create some conflicts that we don't want. Okay. And I hope that made sense. And here, of course, yeah, we don't need to use the link and the visited pseudo classes because this class here is intended to use on all kinds of elements, not just on buttons. But anyway, let's go back here. And now this section here looks quite nice already. So really great work up until this point. It looks really beautiful already. Now, next up, we want to add this small component down here, which has these customer faces that I showed you by the start of the last lecture. And then I think it's also time to select a really nice typeface for our project. Okay? And so we will do all of that in the next part of building this hero section. Let's now continue building and actually finish building our hero section. And in this part 3 of building the hero, let's actually start by selecting a new typeface. So, for that, we will again use Google Fonts. And of course, we need to keep in mind the website personality that we chose. And so that's why I will first show you the 𝗕𝗏 typeface, which, as I mentioned before, is kind of my new favorite. So let's just select a couple here, maybe 400, 500, and 700 here. And then we just copy these 2 lines here. So we already did this a couple of times before. And then remember, we need to paste it before our own style sheet. And now I will simply add 𝗕𝗏 here first. And then as a fallback, if 𝗕𝗏 doesn't work somehow, then sans serif will be used. So let's check that out. And now indeed, if you ask me, it does look a lot better than before. However, I'm not sure if this really fits our personality type so well. I mean, if it was just the startup personality, then I think 𝗕𝗏 is actually a perfect font. But remember that we're also trying to mix some of the personality traits of the calm personality into our design. And so I think that we should use a little bit of a rounder typeface here. So 𝗕𝗏 is a little bit harsh. So look just at this L here. It's like a complete square, like a complete rectangle, and there is nothing round about it. And so maybe this doesn't fit so nice with the overall message of the site and, of course, with the website personality. So we will not choose 𝗕𝗏, actually. So I will remove all here. And instead, let's go back. And now here, of course, you could now spend a lot of time searching for the right typeface for this design. All right, but I already did that work before, because otherwise we would lose a lot of time here. And the perfect typeface that I think fits really nicely into our design is called Rubic. So exactly this one here. Okay, and so let's now select a couple here. So 400 as always. Then I'm actually going with 400, 500, 600, and 700. Okay, and in case we wanted italic text, then we would actually also have to select these italic styles. But I think we will not need that, and so for now I will just leave it like this. And then up here we have our selected families, and then we can just copy this one again. Okay, replace this one here, and then Rubic right here. And wait for it. And there we go. So this typeface, I think, is really, really beautiful and is really a nice mix between the startup personality, but making it a little bit more approachable and looking a bit more caring by being basically a bit more round. So comparing this L here with the one we had before, now it has these nicely rounded corners, and the same is of course true for all the other characters here as well. So really nice. Let's make this here actually the whole size. And yeah, so I think this is the perfect typeface. But as I said, usually when I build a project like this, I keep experimenting throughout the entire project with different typefaces, even at the very end, to see which one fits best. And so when we reach the end of this project, we might also do that again, because then it's actually a perfect time to see the entire layout changing the way it looks, simply by using some different typefaces. But for now, as a work in progress, I think this one here is great. Let's just make these buttons here a little bit bolder now that we have that 600 font weight. So you see that by default we have 400, and then 700 is like really bold, but to make it just a little bit less bold, we can use 600. And so that's what I want to use here on the button. So font weight of 600, and that does look a lot nicer. Okay, but finally, let's now build that component that I mentioned in the very first part of building this hero, which is to have like some customer photos here, and then with some relevant data. And I thought of that because here in this description, we have this sentence here. So basically saying that 𝗦𝗡𝗜𝗖𝗬 delivered 250,000 meals last year, which is kind of really impressive, right? And so I think this gets a bit lost here in this sentence. And so I thought that we could add a nice component here that I saw in that other inspiration. So in that other example. And yeah, I wanted to do the same thing here, basically based on that example. So let's do that. And if we take a look at our images, we actually do have, should be here in the customers. So we have a lot of photos here of customers that we can use. So 6 of them. So let's come back here into our hero text box and basically add that here after these buttons. So again, using a very generic div element, and then I will call it delivered meals. Then here inside of these meals, we need one box for the face images and then another box for the text, or maybe just some paragraph for that text. But anyway, let's call this one here the delivered faces. Okay, could be delivered images as well. Let's actually call it IMGs for images to be a bit more consistent. And then of course our image element source. So that's in IMG. And here we have yet another folder. So IMG/customers/customer_ones. Okay, and here let's add some very simple alt text. So this is just some customer photo. Okay. Now I'm copying this and pasting it a couple of times because we have 6 of them. So this looks a bit strange. So here I don't really agree with the prettier formatting. Yeah, that's a lot better. So here you see they are called 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we just need to replace them here. And I will leave the alt text without any change. Okay, and then here I want that paragraph with the text. So let's get that actually. So it's this one here, right? So of course, actually it's also here. So let me just cut it from here and paste that here. And just to make it a little bit nicer and shorter, let's just say 250,000 meals delivered last year. Okay, let's check that out again. And indeed, that doesn't look so correct. And so we now need to build this small layout for this small component. So that's called delivered meals. And again, I will fix this CSS file here a little bit later because it's starting to get a bit confusing. But anyway, so we want the delivered meals to be side by side with that paragraph. So a good use case for using display flex. And this time I'm actually using flex and not grid because here I don't really care about the size of the columns. We will simply let the content determine the sizes. Okay. Then delivered, well, not meals, but images. So here we also want these images to be side by side. So all the child elements here of delivered images, which are these images, should also become flex elements. And so now let's format these images. But here I didn't give them any class. And well, I usually don't do that when it goes so many levels deep. So here I would now have to call them like delivered img, but that's a bit too much trouble, maybe. So I'm just going to select the img using this descendant selector. So let's give them some height. So based, of course, again here on our rules. So maybe 64 pixels. And if that is too big, we go one step down to 48. So 64, which means 6.4 RAM. And well, usually we do not need to specify a width because it will automatically get adjusted. But there is some bug in the Safari browser when the images are flex items. And so we need to do that here as well. So we simply set the width to the exact same thing to make them squared. Okay, and then we also want to make them round. And since they are squared, we can set the border radius to 50%. Remember that? And so let's check it out, maybe, or actually let's first also style this paragraph here, which I didn't actually give a class yet. So that's delivered text, let's say. Okay, so to give it some visual hierarchy here, let's make it smaller than the paragraph text that we had before, that summary. So where is that? It's right here. So it's at 2 RAM. And so let's go one step down, which is 1.8 RAM. So 18 pixels. So here we are using all of these ideas about visual hierarchy with text and with the entire layout in general as well. And let's give it some font weight, maybe of 600 to make it stand out then a bit more from the rest. Okay, so that's starting to look like something, but these images are way too big for now. So let's fix that. And we also need some spacing here, so some vertical spacing between this component and this button. So let's start with that, actually. And, well, we cannot really add any spacing simply to the buttons here, right? So, again, that would then be against the idea that these buttons should be standalone components. So, which is also the reason why here I added this margin using this helper class, right? So I could create a margin bottom or something class like that, but then I would have to add it to both these buttons. And I think that's not really worth it, because what we can do instead is to simply add some margin to the top of this element here. So delivered meals. So margin top in this case. And here let's use a lot. So maybe 80 pixels. So not quite the 96. That would be a bit too much, but let's try 8 RAM here. Okay. And then, make the images smaller. So stepping down from 64, the next one is 48 pixels. So 4.8 RAM. Okay. And so that is a lot better already. Great. Now what we need to fix is to add some spacing here and align these vertically. And then one very nice thing that we can do here is to kind of overlap these images here on top of each other. So that's something that we see quite often when we have a situation like this, because, well, like this, it looks a bit strange. So we can just overlap them. And I'm sure you have seen this also in practice before. So starting with the spacing and vertical aligning, that is right here on this delivered meals flex container. And so here we need to then add align items, remember, to center everything vertically. And then to add some spacing, we use our gap property. And let's use 16 pixels, so 1.6 rem. Okay, so that fixes that first part. And now remember, the second thing that we wanted to do is to put these images on top of each other. So basically we want to decrease the spacing between them. And so we might think that since we are using a flex container here, so this delivered images which contains the images is also a flex container. And so we might think that here we could set the gap property to a negative value. However, for some reason that doesn't really work. And so here we actually need to work on the individual images themselves. So here we can add a margin to the right with a negative value. And so let's again use, for consistency, 1.6 rem, but then negatively. And so that will basically pull each of the images 16 pixels more to the left. All right. Yeah, so exactly like this. Now, for some reason, the margin, so this gap here is not really being applied. Let's see what's happening there. And so this is where, once again, the dev tools come in very handy. Just make this a bit bigger so you can actually see. So the problem here is that the flex container basically ends right here. And the reason for that is that all the images have this negative margin. Well, it's not really visible here, but we need to basically remove the negative margin from this last one here. That should then fix it. So then this end of the flex container should be back here, and then we should be able to see that margin that is now on top of the image. So let's select the last one. And for that, fortunately, we have our very handy last child pseudo class. And so here we set the margin back to 0. So we could have written margin right as well, but here basically we're setting all the margins back to 0. Okay, and now that is fixed indeed. Right. Now just one more thing, or actually two more things. So first I want to make this one here a bit more visible. And so I'm also giving it this orange color here. And then another thing that we do many times when we overlap images like this is to then add a nice small border to each of them to create basically some visible space between them. And you will see what I mean in a second here once I do that. So basically what I just said is to add a border, let's say 3 pixel solid with the exact same background color as the color that is around the images. So if that was white, we would use white, but in this case that is this background color right here. Actually, it is this color, but it's not coming from here. I mean, it is here from this section hero, right? So that's right here. Right. So this looks a bit nicer. It's just a small detail, you might think, in the small touch, but it makes it immediately look a bit more designed. So as if someone thought a little bit more about this component. And so that is always a good thing to do. Now, finally, as I said, I want to make this text here also orange in order to make it stand out a bit more. So let's wrap it in a span element, which is like a generic text element. So a bit like a div element, but for inline elements. So let's select that again with a descendant selector instead of adding just another class there. So our brand color is this one here, I think. Let's just make sure. Yeah, it's always the one that ends in 22. And since we're already here, let's make it even a little bit bolder. So going all the way to 700. Okay, nice. Let's just make sure that the contrast ratio is actually good here. Because here we are actually using this orange color on top of another orange color. Even though this one here is very light, but I'm actually not sure if it has the correct color contrast ratio. So to check this, we go to this coolers or something website, which one more time it is on my resources page. Then we click away all this stuff. Then here on more, we come to contrast checker. Then we paste our text color here. Well, I'm not sure what that is. It was this text that I copied before. So indeed, I want this. And the background color is this one here. And so you see, it is very poor. So this red background here means that we are in trouble. So let's use the next dark that we have. So this one here. Let's copy this. Let's just make sure it's here already. Actually, it's not. So just again to make sure we have everything in one place. Let's put that here. And it is still poor here, but down here it just became yellow, which is for a large text. But if we take a look here, then we see that level AA requires 3.1 for a large text, so at least 18 pixels, or bold text. And in our case, the text is actually very bold, and so I think we're good to go with that color here. So let's replace that, and there we go. So you think that this might be a very minor thing to worry about, but as I said, I believe, and the whole web developer community believes as well, that we should really strive to make our websites as accessible as possible. And so I think it's not too much to worry about a small detail like this. Okay, and with this, we actually finished building this hero section. So I hope that you like this result. I think it looks really, really beautiful. So great result here. We have some nice visual hierarchy where this text here is closer a little bit to this one because they belong kind of together. Then we have a bit more space between the buttons and then a lot more space. Well, actually not that much space, but still there's a lot more space here than here. And so again, we create a nice visual hierarchy right there. Let me just remember how much we used here. It looks like it's not that much. It was 8 RAM, while here we have 4.8 RAM. But then because of the line height, it is actually a bit more, as we can see here in this blue box that is around it. But still, I think this looks good. Also the spacing between these columns and around everything here looks quite decent. And so yeah, I think this is done for now. And so in the next lecture, we will then also build the header here. So putting the logo here and also start working a bit on the navigation. So that is yet another exciting step to really polish off and finish this whole introduction to our website. And so hopefully I see you there very soon.